a table full of people, laughter, conversation, someone pouring wine, someone checking their phone under the table. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, a person sitting with a smile on their face and a hollow feeling behind the sternum that none of the noise is touching. Now, a cave in the Himalayas, 11th century. One man, no fire worth mentioning, wind coming through the stone. Nothing, no community, no possessions, no one who knows his name tonight. And in the records that survived him, not a single account of loneliness. These two images belong together. Buddhism has known why for 25 centuries. What you will find in the hours ahead is not a comfort that requires better circumstances. It is not a teaching that works only for monks or only for people whose lives have gone quiet by choice. It is something older and more precise than that, an understanding of why the hollow feeling exists, where it actually comes from, and what happens in the mind when it is finally, genuinely released. The peace this tradition points to does not arrive when the right person appears. It does not wait for the table to fill up. It is available in exactly the life you are living right now, in exactly the stillness of this moment. Lie down if you can, and get comfortable. If you'd like, share where in the world you are. Tonight, this space belongs to all of us. The crowd at the full table has existed in every century. The hollow feeling behind the sternum has existed in every century. And 25 centuries ago, in a forest in northern India, a man named Nagita stood between a pressing crowd and a quiet teacher and watched something happen that this tradition has been pointing to ever since. Nagita had been managing crowds long enough to know how they moved. He knew the particular quality of attention that gathered around the Buddha, not rowdy, not disrespectful, but dense and pressing, the way water fills a low space without being asked to. People arrived from nearby villages, from farms still carrying the smell of the morning's work, from households that had interrupted their day the moment word reached them. They positioned themselves outside the forest at Ichanangala, and they waited, which was its own kind of pressure, the pressure of many people wanting one thing, all at once, with complete sincerity. He understood their wanting. He did not question it. Being near the Buddha produced something in people that they could not easily find elsewhere, a quality of stillness, a sense that the most important questions were being held with complete seriousness, a feeling that could not be precisely named, but that people traveled considerable distances to be in the presence of. Of course they came. Of course they pressed forward. Nagita would have done the same had he not already been on the other side of the crowd, standing between the forest and the noise, trying to give his teacher whatever space the situation allowed. The The crowd had been there since morning. By midday it had grown. The sound of it, voices, movement, the occasional call of someone trying to communicate across the group, reached into the trees without difficulty. Nagita moved back and forth, managing what he could, and at some point, he made a decision that seemed, from where he stood, entirely reasonable. He went to the Buddha. He described the crowd, its size, its patience, its evident devotion. He made the case gently and practically. These people had come a long way. They were waiting with goodwill. It would be a generous thing to receive them. Everything in Nagita's reasoning was sound. The crowd was real. Their journey was real. Their wanting was real. And the logic that said, these people want something, you have it, giving it to them would be good. That logic was not wrong exactly. It was simply operating from an assumption so ordinary that Nagita had never thought to examine it. The assumption was this, that being wanted is a reason to be present. The Buddha's response arrived without hesitation and without apology. He told Nagita that he was not at ease with fame. He used a specific word, fasu, which means ease, comfort, the unconstricted quality of a mind that is not being pulled in any direction against its nature. Fame did not give him fasu. Being sought did not give him fasu. And he had understood this with enough clarity that no amount of reasonable argument from Nagita was going to change the direction he was already moving. "Do not trouble me with it," he said. And he walked further into the forest. The crowd outside waited. He did not return. Stand for a moment in Nagita's position as that answer landed. He was not an unintelligent man. He had been close enough to the Buddha's teaching to understand its broad shape, and yet something in that response would have required adjustment, a quiet recalibration of an assumption he had been carrying without knowing it was an assumption. The crowd wanted the Buddha's presence as the condition for their peace. And here was the Buddha, presented with exactly that wanting, choosing the forest instead. Not reluctantly, not with visible effort, with the ease of someone moving towards something natural, rather than away from something uncomfortable. As if the crowd's wanting, however sincere, was simply not the kind of thing that required a response. This is the moment worth sitting inside, because it contains the first and most important distinction this teaching has to offer. The people outside that forest were not suffering because they had no one. They had each other. They had their community. They had traveled together and were waiting together and would return home together. What they were experiencing, that particular pressing forward, that particular inability to simply turn around and go home without having received what they came for, was not loneliness in the conventional sense. It was craving. The specific, uncomfortable insistence that peace was not available to them until a certain condition was met. Proximity to the Buddha, his attention, his presence in their field of awareness. strip the ancient setting away for a moment and look at the mechanism. A group of people, each individually capable of a perfectly adequate afternoon, rendered restless and driven by the conviction that something they needed was just beyond reach. Not materially unreachable, the forest was right there. Not permanently unavailable, the Buddha was 20 feet away. But withheld by circumstances, which produced in them a state of dissatisfaction that no amount of each other's company was resolving. The wanting was the suffering, not the distance, not the waiting. The wanting itself, the contract the mind had written that said, "I will be settled once I have this, and not before." Buddhism calls this craving, and it is worth being precise about what that word means and what it does not mean. It does not mean desire in the ordinary sense. It does not mean love or preference or the natural human orientation toward connection and warmth and being known by someone. All of those things are part of a healthy life, and Buddhism has never argued otherwise. Craving is something more specific, the point at which wanting tips into demand, where the mind stops being open to what is present and starts insisting on what is absent. The point where a person stops experiencing an ordinary Friday evening and starts experiencing a problem that needs to be solved before peace is permitted. The crowd at Ichanangala had tipped into that territory. Their devotion was real, and their craving was also real, and the two things were not in contradiction. They had simply fused in the way they almost always do, until the wanting felt indistinguishable from the caring, and neither Nagita nor anyone in the crowd would have thought to separate them. The Buddha had separated them. That was precisely what made his answer so clean and so untroubled. He cared about those people. The 45 years he spent walking between villages and sitting with whoever arrived with genuine questions is evidence enough of that. What he did not have was craving for their presence. He did not need to be needed. He did not require the crowd's wanting in order to feel that the day had value. He did not experience their absence once he had walked into the trees as a problem requiring resolution. Their wanting reached the forest and stopped at the edge, and he moved through the interior in the same quality of ease he would have moved through it had no one gathered outside at all. This is what the Buddhist teaching calls the first noble truth, not a pessimistic claim about life, but a precise observation about a specific mechanism. There is suffering, it says, and it is worth examining rather than explaining away. Not the suffering of catastrophe or extraordinary loss, but the ordinary ambient friction of a mind that keeps placing conditions on its own peace. The restlessness of an evening without plans, the weight of an unanswered message, the particular hollowness of a full table that is somehow not enough. All of it arising not from what is absent, but from the craving for what is absent. What changes when you see this clearly is the location of the work. If the suffering is caused by the absence of people, then the only solution is people, and you are dependent on circumstances you cannot control, waiting for conditions to change, hoping the right person appears, and the craving is satisfied, which it will be, temporarily, until it finds a new condition to attach to. This is the cycle Nagita's crowd was caught in without knowing it. Satisfied today if the Buddha came out, needing to return tomorrow, and the day after, the condition met, and then the bar quietly moved, the way it always does. But if the suffering is caused by the craving, by the mind's own insistence on the condition, then everything shifts. The problem is no longer out there in the unanswered message or the empty chair. It is in the pattern of a mind that has learned to make its peace conditional. And that pattern, unlike the behavior of other people, is something that can actually be worked with. The Buddha walking into that forest was not a man turning away from life. He was not performing indifference or practicing some austere discipline that required him to deny the warmth of human contact. He was moving toward the thing that actually gave him ease, with the uncomplicated directness of someone who had examined his own mind carefully enough to know exactly where peace lived and exactly where it did not. The forest was not a consolation prize for a man who could not have the crowd. The forest was the point. Nagita returned to the crowd outside and managed their disappointment as best he could. What he carried back with him, aside from the practical news that the audience would not be happening, was something harder to articulate. The image of a man receiving the news of his own fame, the way you might receive an irrelevant weather report from a distant city. Heard, acknowledged, and left entirely where it landed. That quality, the mind that receives wanting without being moved by it, that hears the crowd and chooses the forest anyway, not from hardness, but from a deep and practiced clarity about what actually produces ease, is not a personality type. It is not something you either have or do not have. It is something the tradition insists can be understood and trained and gradually inhabited by anyone willing to look carefully at the mechanism underneath their own restlessness. Which requires, first, being honest about what that restlessness actually is. Not loneliness, in the simple sense. Not a social problem with a social solution. A pattern of mind, specific, examinable, and far more workable than it feels on a quiet Friday evening when the phone stays dark and the silence will not settle. The Buddha understood this by examining his own experience with complete honesty. What that examination revealed was not that people are a problem or that connection is worthless. It was something more precise and more useful, that there is a difference, a real, felt, consequential difference between being alone because you have been left and being alone because you have chosen stillness. He knew which one he was doing. He knew it in his body, in the quality of ease that accompanied him into the trees. Learning to know that difference in your own experience is exactly where this journey continues, and it begins with a monk who was completely certain he already knew it, who had built his entire sense of himself around that certainty, and who was about to discover that carrying the word without the understanding is one of the most human mistakes there is. He had done the work. That much was clear to him, and he saw no particular reason to be modest about it. Modesty belongs to people who are uncertain, and he was not uncertain. He had looked honestly at what the path required: genuine solitude, real renunciation of the noise and distraction that kept most monks comfortable but spiritually stationary, and he had delivered. The evidence was unambiguous. He slept alone, not in the communal dwelling where monks talked too late into the evening about things that advanced no one's practice. Alone, in a separate space, with no one's breathing but his own. He ate alone, while the other monks gathered at mealtimes with the social ease of people who had made community into a comfortable habit. He took his bowl and found a tree and sat with his food and his thoughts and did not consider this a deprivation. He walked alone, the forest paths in the early morning, before the community stirred, before anyone could attach themselves to his routine with the particular clinginess of people who call it companionship. Those belong to him. He had understood what solitude required, and he had done it. Completely, consistently, without complaint. There is a specific satisfaction available to people who have set themselves a difficult standard and met it, and he was in possession of that satisfaction. He wore it the way people wear things they have genuinely earned, not loudly, but unmistakably. When the opportunity arose to speak with the Buddha about his practice, he took it with the quiet confidence of someone presenting work they know to be good. He described his living arrangement, the separate dwelling, the solitary meals, the unaccompanied walks, with the care of a person who wants to be sure the full picture is understood. There was no boasting in his tone, or so he would have said. Simply accuracy, a fair account of a life genuinely lived according to what the teaching seemed to require. The Buddha listened to all of it, and then he said, "There is indeed a way of living in solitude, and what you have described is not quite it." The teaching that followed is one of the most quietly precise corrections in the entire Pali Canon. Not harsh, not dismissive, but so exact that there is very little space to stand outside it and pretend it does not apply. Anyone who has ever confused the outer form of a practice with its inner substance will find themselves somewhere in it. And most people, if they are honest, have confused this particular outer form with its inner substance at some point, because the confusion is so natural, so available, so easy to maintain without ever noticing it is happening. True solitude, the Buddha taught, has nothing to do with who sleeps in the next room or who sits beside you at a meal. Physical separation, however complete, however consistently maintained, is simply an arrangement of bodies in space. It may support genuine solitude. It may create conditions that make inner quiet more accessible, but it cannot produce what it is being asked to produce, and mistaking the container for the contents is one of the most comfortable errors on the path. Comfortable precisely because the container is so visible, so measurable, so easy to point to as evidence that something real is happening. The monk who is truly living in solitude, the Buddha said, is the one who has abandoned what is past, who has not grasped at what is future, and who has thoroughly removed desire and delight in what is present. 3 times. Past, future, present. Not the arrangement of bodies in space, but the arrangement of the mind in time. The past first, and the word the Buddha uses here is abandoned, not managed, not visited, and then set aside with effort, but genuinely released. The conversation that ended badly and is still being revised in the small hours of the night, 4 years after the person involved has moved to a different city and probably does not think about it anymore. The relationship that closed without the resolution that was wanted, still carried with the weight of something unfinished, even though the finishing was never going to arrive in the form the mind kept waiting for. The moment of humiliation, of being misunderstood, of having said the wrong thing at the wrong time, in front of the wrong person, still present in the memory with a vividness that has no relationship to how long ago it occurred. A person can be physically alone in a forest clearing with no human being within 2 miles. And if the mind is inside a conversation from years ago, revising it, re-arguing it, arriving at better conclusions, in a version of events that will never be made available to anyone involved, that person is not in solitude. They are in the past, alone in body and crowded in mind, keeping their own suffering company with a loyalty that costs everything and helps no one. The future next, and the instruction here is not grasped at, which is worth distinguishing carefully from do not think about the future, because they are not the same instruction and the difference matters. Thinking about the future is sometimes useful and often unavoidable, and nothing in this teaching argues against it. Grasping is different. The mind treating its own projections as emergencies requiring immediate preparation, building elaborate scenarios around events that have not happened and may never happen, expending genuine energy on complete fictions with an urgency that suggests real problems are being addressed when they are not. The rehearsed arguments for conversations that will unfold entirely differently than rehearsed, because they always do. The anticipated disasters that arrive when they arrive at all informs the rehearsal did nothing to prepare for. The general, low-frequency insistence that something must be resolved or figured out before the mind is permitted to rest. A person can be sitting in a room so quiet they can hear their own heartbeat and be living entirely in the following week, a resident of a time that does not yet exist, borrowing worry from a future that may look nothing like the one being so carefully constructed. And then the present, the most subtle of the 3, and the one the Buddha names with the most precision: desire and delight in what is present, not craving for something absent, not anxiety about something approaching, but the mind's tendency to clutch at the actual moment as it is occurring, to need it to be a certain way, to experience what is genuinely here through the continuous filter of whether it matches what was expected or wanted. The quiet evening that should feel restful, but feels instead like a problem waiting to be correctly identified. The solitude that should feel spacious but feels like evidence of something that has gone wrong or failed to arrive. The present moment is the only place peace could possibly live, and yet the mind keeps placing requirements on it that it must meet before it qualifies as acceptable. This is the subtlest form of clutching, and in some ways the most persistent, because it disguises itself as discernment, as standards, as simply knowing what a good evening should feel like. This is what the proud monk had not examined. He had arranged his body in solitude with considerable care and consistency and a quiet, private satisfaction. What he had not looked at was what his mind was doing inside all of that carefully arranged physical quiet. The honest answer to that question, the answer most people arrive at when they sit with it long enough, is that the mind was doing what untrained minds do, going everywhere at once. Backward into memory, forward into anticipation, sideways into comparison and grievance, and the low-level administrative busyness of a mind that has learned to stay occupied as a default setting rather than as a conscious choice. He was alone in the way that is easy to count and point to as evidence. He was not alone in the way the teaching means. The recognition this produces tends to arrive quietly and sit with a mild discomfort that, if you do not rush to escape it, becomes something closer to relief. Because if the suffering of aloneness is not caused by aloneness, if it is caused by the mind's own habits of clutching at all 3 times simultaneously, then changing location will not resolve it, but something else might. The problem has moved from the circumstances, which cannot be fully controlled, to the mind, which can be trained. In the Buddhist understanding, this is almost always good news, not comfortable news, not news that makes the next few months easier, but the specific good news of a problem that has moved into a place where it can actually be worked with. It also explains something most people have noticed without being able to fully name: why a crowded room is sometimes easier than genuine aloneness. Not because connection is the answer, and not because distraction is better than presence, but because external noise is effective at covering internal noise. The conversation that fills the evening, the plans that keep the calendar occupied, the company that ensures the difficult quiet never quite arrives, all of it works, in the short term, at preventing the mind from having to sit with its own contents. The difficulty is that it works the way a bandage over an untreated wound works. The problem is covered rather than addressed, and the covering must be maintained continuously, or the original condition reasserts itself, usually at an inconvenient hour and with renewed intensity. The Buddha's response to the proud monk was not a suggestion that he abandon his separate dwelling or rejoin the communal meals. It was a correction of the assumption, the quiet, unexamined assumption, that the outer arrangement was producing an inner result it was not capable of producing on its own. What produces the inner result is simpler to state and considerably harder to inhabit. A mind that has released its grip on all three times and settled, without requirement or resistance, into the only moment that actually exists. That is what this teaching means by solitude. Not a room without people, not a schedule without company. A mind that has genuinely stopped clutching at the past it cannot change, the future it cannot fully predict, and the present it keeps trying to reshape into something it already is. The gap between understanding that clearly and actually living it is where most of the real work takes place. It does not close through a single correction, however precise, or a single teaching, however well-timed. It closes through something slower and more interior, through the gradual process of learning to stay inside the discomfort of one's own company, long enough to understand what that discomfort is actually made of, and to discover, eventually, that it is workable. For some people, finding the willingness to begin that process takes years. A whole lifetime, sometimes, of wanting the inner quiet while remaining afraid of what genuine inner quiet might reveal, circling the edge of the forest, close enough to feel its pull, far enough to maintain the safety of whatever noise is available. There was a man in ancient India who understood that particular circling more intimately than almost anyone who left a record of it. He had spent decades in a world built entirely on performance, on noise, on the skilled management of other people's attention and emotions. He knew exactly how to fill a room and keep it full, how to hold a crowd, how to ensure that silence never became uncomfortable for anyone present. And for years, in the middle of all of that, something kept pulling him in the opposite direction, toward the forest, toward the silence, toward a life that had no audience and required nothing to be performed. He could not explain the pull. He could not silence it either. And the conversation he eventually began to have with his own mind about it, the long, honest, sometimes anguished interior dialogue between the person he was performing and the quiet he was seeking, became one of the most vivid accounts of this particular human struggle that the ancient world left behind. He was not a monk when this started. He was an actor. The smell of stage makeup is particular enough that people who have worn it never fully forget it. Thick and waxy and slightly sweet, it sits on the skin with a weight that ordinary soap only partially removes. You can wash your face after a performance and still catch traces of it hours later, a ghost of the person you spent the evening being for other people's benefit. The sound of a crowd applauding is also particular, not just loud, directional, pressing, arriving at the body from all sides simultaneously, filling the chest with something that is not quite pride and not quite relief, but has elements of both. For a few seconds after the final bow, while the sound is still at its peak, there is a feeling of complete sufficiency, the sense that this moment, this response, This evidence of having reached people is exactly what the work was for. And then the crowd begins to leave, and the sound drops by half, and then by half again, and then the door at the back of the hall opens and closes one final time, and the silence that follows is not the silence of a forest or a meditation room or a dawn before anyone has woken. It is the silence of a space that was just full and is now empty, which is a different quality of silence entirely, and one that tends to ask questions the noise was successfully preventing. The person standing in the wings after everyone has gone knows this silence well. They are surrounded by people, colleagues moving equipment, friends waiting to offer congratulations, the warm, familiar machinery of a life built around performance and company, and the continuous exchange of energy between a person and their audience. And underneath all of that warmth, at a depth the warmth does not quite reach, something is asking a question that the evening's success has not answered. Not dissatisfaction, not ingratitude, something more like the feeling of having been seen clearly in all the wrong directions simultaneously, witnessed from every angle except the one that would have mattered. This is not a modern problem. In ancient India, 25 centuries ago, there was a theatre director and lead actor named Talaputta who understood this feeling with a precision that survived him by millennia. His words are preserved in the Therigatha, the songs of the elder monks, one of the oldest collections in the Pali canon, and they have the quality of something written not for an audience, but in spite of one. Not performance, the opposite of performance. A man finally, after a very long time, speaking honestly to himself. Talaputta had built a life around the management of emotion at scale. A theatre director in ancient India was not a minor figure. His work involved training performers, managing productions, holding the attention of crowds, with the skilled use of story and character, and the manufactured feelings that a good performance produces in people who have paid to feel something for an evening. He was good at this. He had been doing it long enough to be trusted with it, relied upon for it, identified by it. His entire professional and social existence was structured around the movement of emotion through rooms full of people, and his own emotions were, professionally speaking, material to be shaped and deployed, rather than simply experienced. And somewhere inside all of that, for years before he did anything about it, something kept pulling him toward the forest. Not dramatically, not as a crisis or a breakdown or a sudden collapse of everything he had built. More like a persistent low note under the rest of the music, present during performances, present during the congratulations afterward, present in the wings while the crowd was still applauding, present in the particular quality of the silence once they had gone. A pull towards something he did not have a precise name for, toward a quality of quiet that no amount of successful performance was producing, toward a life that required nothing to be performed and no crowd to receive the performance. He did not go, not yet. He kept directing, kept performing, kept filling rooms and receiving the response of filled rooms, and the pull kept being there, and he kept not following it. This went on for years. The Theragatha does not give a specific number, but the weight of his verses suggests a long time, long enough for the gap between the life he was living and the life the pull was gesturing toward to become a source of real interior friction. What makes Talaputta remarkable in the literature is not that he eventually went to the forest. Many people went to the forest. What makes him remarkable is what he did with the years before he went, which was to begin a conversation with his own mind that is almost without parallel in the ancient world for its honesty, its specificity, and its lack of performance. He addressed his mind directly, not as a figure of speech, as a being he was in relationship with, a companion he had been ignoring for years, a voice he had been managing and redirecting and keeping occupied with the business of performance so it could not ask its real questions. He spoke to it the way you might speak to someone you have been avoiding for a long time and have finally agreed to sit down with honestly. When, he asked his own mind, will you finally let me go? When will I sit alone in the mountains and see things as they actually are? How long are you going to keep me here, filling rooms, managing crowds, producing feelings in other people, while your own remain unexamined? His mind answered back. Not immediately, and not with the answers he wanted, but the conversation had begun. And once begun, it could not be entirely put aside. This interior dialogue, preserved across more than 40 verses in the Theragatha, is one of the most psychologically precise documents of this particular human struggle that the ancient world left behind. Not the struggle to be good, or disciplined, or spiritually accomplished. The specific struggle of a person who knows, somewhere beneath the performance, what they actually need, and keeps finding reasons not to go there yet. The mind he is speaking to is recognizable. It is the voice that comments on everything you do as you are doing it, the running interior commentary that assesses, compares, anticipates, remembers, worries, and plans, rarely pausing, and almost never simply present. Most people spend their entire lives in continuous relationship with this voice, without ever quite noticing that it is the relationship that most shapes their experience of everything else. It is the first thing present in the morning and the last thing quieted at night, and its quality, whether it is hostile or kind, whether it is honest or defensive, whether it can sit in silence without immediately filling the silence with noise, determines more about how any given day feels than almost any external circumstance. Talaputta had been, for years, in a relationship with his own mind, characterized primarily by management and avoidance. Keep it busy. Give it a production to run, a performance to shape, a crowd to attend to. The mind that is fully occupied with external demands is a mind that cannot turn its full attention inward, and turning attention inward to the unexamined questions the unresolved feelings, the gap between the life being performed and the life being wanted, is uncomfortable enough that most people prefer not to. This is what performance provides that rest does not. Not just company, not just distraction in the ordinary sense, but the specific service of keeping the mind's attention pointed outward with sufficient intensity that the inward questions cannot quite make themselves heard. A packed schedule, a full social life, a continuous demand for presence and responsiveness, all of these work in the same way to maintain a particular kind of interior silence that is not peace, but that resembles it closely enough to be mistaken for it. Talaputta knew this. He had been using it for years, and the conversations he began to have with his own mind were, in part, a reckoning with exactly that, with the fact that the noise he had arranged his life around was not separate from the pull toward the forest, but was, in some sense, the reason for it. The forest kept calling because the noise kept failing to provide what he actually needed, and it kept failing because what he actually needed was not available through noise at any volume. When he finally went forth, when he finally left the theatre, left the productions, left the crowds and the applause and the makeup and the particular silence after the audience had gone, the liberation he was seeking did not arrive immediately. The Theragatha is honest about this in a way that makes it more useful than texts that describe transformation as sudden and complete. He sat in the forest, and the mind kept doing what untrained minds do, going backward, going forward, filling the silence with the contents of a long and performance-saturated life that did not immediately release its hold, simply because the external conditions had changed. He had removed the noise from outside. The noise inside required different work. The work was the conversation, continued now not as complaint or as negotiation, but as genuine inquiry, speaking to his own mind with the honesty he had spent years withholding from it, asking real questions and sitting with the answers, rather than redirecting the attention back to the next production. Treating his own mind, in other words, not as a mechanism to be managed, but as the closest companion he had, which it was and had always been, whether or not he had been treating it that way. What the Theragatha records is the gradual shift from that management to that companionship, from a mind addressed as an obstacle to a mind addressed as a partner, in the only investigation that the forest made possible, not the investigation of texts or doctrines or the external forms of practice, the investigation of what was actually happening inside, moment by moment, in the silence that the performance had for so long been covering. This is what the Buddhist tradition means when it talks about the mind as a companion rather than an enemy. Not a relationship of suppression, where the noisy parts are forced into compliance through discipline or sheer will. A relationship of genuine acquaintance, sitting with the voice long enough to understand what it is actually saying, why it keeps returning to the same territories, what it is trying to protect by maintaining its particular habits of noise and deflection and avoidance. The companionship that results from that quality of honest attention is something cultivated rather than inherited, something that requires, as Talaputta required, the willingness to have the conversation rather than keep arranging circumstances, so the conversation never quite becomes necessary. His verses end in a place of genuine rest. Not the rest of someone who has silenced everything difficult, but the rest of someone who has stayed in the conversation long enough that the difficult things have been fully heard, and having been heard, have lost some of their insistence. The mind that was once managed from a distance has become, through years of honest interior dialogue, something closer to home, not silent, not perfect, home. What Talaputta needed from the crowd was many things: the energy, the work, the skilled deflection of his own inward questions. But underneath all of those things was something more specific, something the crowd was providing that he had not yet learned to provide for himself. The sense of being witnessed, of existing fully in the eyes of others, of having one's presence confirmed by the response it produced in a room full of people who were paying attention. This particular hunger is worth naming carefully, because it is among the most common and least examined of the cravings that make solitude feel like deprivation rather than freedom. And in the next part of this journey, it meets its most direct challenge in a forest, at dawn, through a woman sitting alone in meditation, when someone arrives specifically to tell her that who she is will never be enough. What she says back changed something in the tradition permanently. You are not enough. That is the voice. Not loud, not dramatic, not arriving with any particular announcement. It comes in the specific quiet that opens up when the performance Talaputta spent decades maintaining finally stops, when the crowd has gone, when the phone is dark, when the room is genuinely still, and there is nothing left to manage, or produce, or direct outward. In that quiet, the voice finds its opening, and it knows, with unerring accuracy, exactly where to press. You are not enough. Something is wrong with you. If you were the right kind of person, someone would be here. If you were more interesting, more attractive, more compelling, more whatever it is that makes people stay, someone would have stayed. The silence around you is not neutral. It is evidence. A verdict delivered without a trial by the simple, observable fact of your aloneness. Most people know this voice. Not as a stranger, but as something closer and more familiar than they would prefer. A companion so habitual that its presence is barely noticed until the external noise drops below a certain threshold, and it becomes, suddenly and uncomfortably, the loudest thing in the room. It is the voice that makes solitude feel like punishment rather than space. The voice that turns a quiet evening into a case for the prosecution. The voice that ensures the mind is never truly alone, even when the body is, because it fills every available silence with a relentless, personalized assessment of what the silence means. Buddhism has a name for the force this voice represents. It is called Mara, and understanding what that name actually means is more useful than it might initially appear. In the Pali Canon, Mara appears as a figure, a presence, sometimes almost a character, arriving at specific moments to undermine, destabilize, and distract practitioners from clarity. This has occasionally been read as mythology, as the Buddhist tradition's version of a tempter or adversary. But the teaching embedded in Mara's appearances is psychological rather than cosmological. Mara represents the forces operating within the mind itself, the patterns of craving, aversion, and delusion that generate suffering not from outside but from the interior, and that speak, always, in the most plausible and personal of voices. Not as an obvious enemy, as a familiar one, as something that sounds, often, like your own honest assessment of yourself. In the forest outside a village in ancient India, at midday, there was a nun sitting alone in meditation. Her name was Soma, the Therigatha, the songs of the elder women, among the oldest literature composed and preserved by women in human history, records what happened in that forest with the economy and precision characteristic of texts that have been carried carefully across centuries because their contents are worth preserving. Soma was sitting undisturbed. The sun was high. The forest had the quality of midday stillness that anyone who has sat in one will recognize. Not silence exactly, but a settling, a reduction of movement, as if the heat has convinced everything living to pause for a few hours and simply be where it is. She was in that stillness, in that forest, alone, and apparently at ease with both. Mara arrived, and the first thing he said was this: that place which is hard to attain, can a woman with two-finger wisdom ever reach it? Two-finger wisdom. The phrase requires a moment of context to land with its full weight. In ancient India, two fingers were used to test whether rice was cooked, pressed into the grain, to check its softness, to determine whether it was ready to serve. It was domestic work, practical work, work considered appropriate for women and beneath the concern of anyone engaged in matters of substance. Two-finger wisdom, therefore, was not a neutral description. It was a comprehensive dismissal, the suggestion that women's knowledge was, by nature, confined to the kitchen and the practical management of household tasks, and that the place Soma was sitting, the practice she was engaged in, the liberation she was moving toward, was simply not territory available to someone of her kind. The taunt was aimed with precision. It knew exactly what it was targeting. Not Soma's practice, not her intelligence, not any specific action she had taken. It targeted her category, her identity, the fixed, unchosen fact of who she was before she had done anything at all. It said, regardless of what you have understood, regardless of how long you have sat, regardless of what the practice has produced in you, you are the wrong kind of person for this, and that disqualification precedes everything else. This is the voice's most sophisticated move. Not attacking what you have done, but what you are. Not pointing at a failure, but at a nature. Not suggesting you have made a mistake, but that you are one. And it is sophisticated precisely because it is the hardest kind of attack to argue against, because you cannot debate your way out of a characterization that has been placed below the level where debate operates. You cannot produce evidence against it because the voice has already decided what counts as evidence and what does not. You cannot prove it wrong because it has positioned itself as the standard by which proof is measured. Most people, encountering this voice in the quiet of genuine solitude, do one of several things. They argue back, which gives the voice exactly the engagement it requires to persist. They suppress it, which drives it underground temporarily, where it continues its work below the threshold of conscious attention. They leave the solitude, which removes the conditions under which the voice becomes audible, while leaving the voice itself entirely intact for the next time the quiet arrives. Or they accept the verdict, which is the most costly response and the most common. Soma did none of these things. Her response to Mara's taunt is recorded in the Theragatha in a few lines that have been studied and returned to for 25 centuries, and which remain, in their quiet way, among the most complete answers ever given to this particular attack. She said, "What does the woman's nature do to one whose mind is well concentrated, in whom knowledge appears, who sees the Dhamma clearly?" Read that again slowly, not as a rhetorical flourish, as a precise instruction about where to look. What does the woman's nature do? The category, the identity, the unchosen fact being deployed as disqualification to one whose mind is well concentrated. What does it do to the knowledge that has appeared? What does it do to the clarity that is already present? The answer embedded in the question is nothing. It does nothing. It is irrelevant. The category has no purchase on what has already been seen. This is not defiance. Defiance would require Soma to position herself against the taunt, to say, "I am a woman, and I can still reach that place. Watch me. I will prove it to you." That response accepts the taunt's framing, accepts that the category matters, and attempts to overcome it through demonstration. What Soma does is entirely different. She does not accept the framing. She does not step into the argument at all. She simply points at what is already true, and in pointing at it, reveals that the voice has been speaking about something that has no relationship to where she actually is. Mara left. The texts record this with the same economy they apply to his arrival. He came, he spoke, she answered, he left. Nothing dramatic. No battle, no struggle, no extended confrontation. The voice arrived, found nothing to attach to, and departed. This is the teaching about craving, to be seen that Buddhism has been carrying since Soma sat in that forest. The voice that says, "You are not enough," is not silenced by proving it wrong. It is not managed by distraction, or suppressed by discipline, or defeated by accumulating sufficient evidence of your own worth. It loses its power specifically, and only when the mind has found something more stable to rest on than the ongoing project of being seen, validated, and confirmed by external sources. The craving to be seen is worth understanding with precision because it is more specific than the general desire for connection and more consequential than it is usually given credit for. In Buddhist teaching, it falls under what is called craving for existence, the particular form of craving that needs the self to be confirmed, witnessed, and affirmed by others in order to feel real. Not love, not companionship, not the ordinary human warmth of being known by someone, something more urgent and more conditional than any of those things. The specific insistence that existence is only fully valid when it is being observed and approved. This craving is why solitude hurts in the way it hurts. Not because the body lacks company, because the mind, operating from this particular form of craving, treats the absence of external confirmation as evidence of non-existence. The unanswered message is not just practically inconvenient, it registers in the craving mind as a small withdrawal of the proof that you are real and worth responding to. The empty calendar is not just logistically quiet, it reads as an indication that no one requires your presence, which the craving mind translates directly into a statement about your value. The voice that says you are not enough is craving, wearing the costume of honest self-assessment, and it is so convincing precisely because the craving is so habitual that its conclusions feel like observations rather than constructions. The Dhammapada addresses the mind's relationship to this kind of suffering directly. The mind, it says, is difficult to guard, swift, and wanders where it wishes. But the wise one guards it, and a guarded mind brings great ease. The word guarded here does not mean suppressed, or policed, or forcibly prevented from its natural movements. It means known, observed with enough clarity and consistency that its patterns become visible, and visible patterns can be met with understanding rather than simply obeyed. Soma's clarity in that forest was not the result of having no inner voice, no Mara, no craving left to speak in her direction. It was the result of having sat with her own mind long enough, in exactly the way Talaputta eventually sat with his, that the voice's moves were no longer surprising and its conclusions no longer automatically accepted as facts. She could hear it clearly enough to see through it, which is an entirely different relationship to the voice than either fighting it or believing it. What that relationship produces is not coldness. not the sealed-off quality of someone who has decided other people do not matter, not indifference, not hardness, not the performance of someone who is above the need for connection. What it produces is the specific freedom of a mind that no longer requires external confirmation in order to function, that can be alone without treating the aloneness as a verdict, that can be unseen without treating the invisibility as evidence, that can exist fully in a forest at midday with no audience and find the existing entirely sufficient. This freedom is not the absence of relationship. It is the presence of a ground stable enough to make genuine relationship possible, because a person reaching for connection from the craving to be seen is not actually reaching for another person. They are reaching for confirmation of their own existence and using the other person as the instrument through which that confirmation is sought, which is an exhausting thing to be, and a distorting lens through which to try to know anyone clearly. When the craving is no longer driving the reaching, when connection is wanted rather than needed, appreciated rather than required, the quality of what becomes possible between people changes entirely. But that change begins not in relationship but in the forest, in the midday stillness, in the willingness to sit with the voice long enough to see what it is actually made of, and to discover that its authority over you is exactly as solid as you allow it to be. Soma allowed it nothing. Not through effort, not through suppression, not through years of disciplined resistance. Through clarity, the specific, practiced clarity of a mind that had learned to see the voice for what it was before the voice had finished its first sentence. Mara left the forest. The midday sun continued. The stillness remained exactly as it had been before the voice arrived, which is itself the teaching, if you sit with it long enough. What was left after the voice departed was not emptiness. It was something that has been described by practitioners across every century of this tradition, in every language Buddhism has traveled through, with a consistency that suggests they were all pointing at the same thing. Something quieter than the noise and more stable than anything the noise had ever offered. Buddhist teachers have spent lifetimes finding words for it, and one of them, a Thai forest master who spent 60 years in practice and another 60 in teaching, distilled it into a single sentence so precise that it has been carried by his students around the world ever since. That sentence is where this journey continues. If you let go a little, you will have a little peace. If you let go a lot, you will have a lot of peace. If you let go completely, you will have complete peace. Notice what it does not say. It does not say, release everything at once. It does not position partial letting go as insufficient, or suggest that a little peace is somehow not the real thing, or imply that anything short of complete liberation is missing the point. It says the relationship between releasing and peace is direct, proportional, and available right now, in whatever small measure can actually be managed today, in this life, with this mind, in the middle of everything this particular week contains. A little release, a little peace, not as consolation, as the beginning of something real. Now notice what you are holding. Not physically, though the body holds things too, in the shoulders, in the jaw, in the specific tightness that accumulates across a day of managing what cannot be managed and accepting what cannot be accepted. Notice what the mind is holding. The conversation that ended 3 weeks ago, in a way that still does not sit right, still being turned over, still being revised into a version that would have gone differently if only the words had been arranged more carefully, or the timing had been better, or the other person had been willing to hear what was actually being said. The relationship whose ending has not been fully accepted, still held at a certain angle in the mind, still examined from slightly different positions to see if it resolves into something other than what it is. The message that has not come, the choice that has not been made in your favor, the silence from someone whose attention still carries more weight than you would prefer it to. Feel the grip of that holding, not as a metaphor, as a physical fact, because the mind's holding is always registered somewhere in the body, always translated into a particular quality of vigilance, a low-grade alertness that never fully releases, because releasing would mean accepting something the mind is not yet prepared to accept. It is exhausting in the specific way that sustained tension is exhausting, not the clean tiredness of having worked and finished, but the accumulated fatigue of a grip that has no natural endpoint, that cannot be resolved by sleeping or eating or any ordinary form of rest, because it continues through all of those things, quiet and persistent, maintaining its hold on whatever it has decided cannot be put down. Most people carry this exhaustion so consistently that it has become the baseline, the ordinary condition of a mind operating at its habitual level of tension, unremarkable because it has never been otherwise, invisible because it is simply what thinking feels like from the inside. It is only when the grip loosens, even briefly, that the contrast becomes available, the sudden, slightly startling quality of a mind that has set something down and noticed, for the first time in a long time, what the absence of that particular weight actually feels like. Not emptiness. Something closer to space, the specific quality of a room after heavy furniture has been moved out of it, larger than expected, quieter than expected, with a quality of air that was always there, but that the furniture made impossible to notice. Before going further, it is worth being precise about what clinging actually is, because it is among the most misrepresented concepts in how Buddhism is commonly discussed. Clinging is not love made too intense. It is not caring taken to an extreme. It is not the natural human orientation toward warmth and connection and being known by someone. All of those things are part of a fully lived life, and nothing in this teaching argues otherwise. Clinging is the specific addition to love or care of the demand that its object behave in a particular way, in order for the love or care to continue, or in order for the person experiencing it to remain at peace. The love is real. The clinging is the contract written around it. I will be okay, only as long as this continues in this form, and the fear of its ending, and the vigilance required to monitor its continuation, and the exhaustion of maintaining that vigilance across every ordinary day. Ajahn Chah's sentence does not ask for the love to be released. It asks for the contract to be loosened, a little, then more, then as much as can be managed today, in the knowledge that each loosening produces its proportional relief, and that the relief itself is the most reliable instruction available about the direction worth continuing in. The quality that develops through this loosening has a name in the Buddhist tradition. It is called equanimity, and it is worth being precise about what that word means and what it does not mean, because it is among the most misunderstood qualities in the Buddhist vocabulary. It does not mean detachment in the sense of disconnection, the sealed quality of someone who has decided that nothing matters and found a spiritual framework for maintaining that decision. It does not mean the performance of calm, the managed exterior of a person who is suppressing considerable internal weather and calling the suppression peace. It does not mean the absence of feeling or the end of caring, or the decision to stop being affected by anything. Equanimity is the stable ground that remains when clinging has been set down. Not the absence of engagement, but the presence of a particular steadiness that makes genuine engagement possible. The quality of being fully present with what is happening without being overturned by it, moved by experience without being swept entirely away by it, in contact with the full range of what a life contains, without requiring that range to be narrower or more comfortable or better arranged than it is. The Buddha offered his son Rahula a simile for this quality that has the simplicity of something obvious and the depth of something that rewards years of returning to. He told him to develop a mind like the earth. The earth receives everything. This is not a poetic observation. It is a practical one, and the Buddha made it practically. People throw clean things on the earth and filthy things on the earth, pleasant things and unpleasant things, the beautiful and the repellent, what is welcomed and what is not. The earth receives all of it without preference and without recoil. It is not horrified by what is thrown on it. It is not humiliated. It is not destroyed. It does not contract with disgust or expand with pleasure or alter its fundamental nature based on what it has received on any particular day. It remains what it is, does what it does, continues to be the ground beneath everything, regardless of what everything happens to consist of. What would it mean to receive blame like the earth receives it? Not to be unaffected in the sense of not noticing. The earth notices, in its way, everything that lands on it, but not to be overturned by it, not to have the ground of your own experience shifted fundamentally by the fact that someone has thrown something unpleasant in your direction. The blame arrives, lands, is received, and the ground remains, the ground. What would it mean to receive silence? The specific silence of someone who is not responding, who is not choosing you, who is not providing the confirmation the craving mind has decided it requires, like the earth receives whatever lands on it. Not indifference to the silence, not the performed nonchalance of someone pretending not to mind, but the genuine stability of a ground that is not threatened by what it receives, because its nature is not dependent on the nature of what lands on it. What would it mean to receive rejection, absence, the ending of something wanted, the non-arrival of something hoped for, with that same quality of stable, undevastated receiving? These are not rhetorical questions. They are practice instructions in the form of questions, and the Buddha gave them to Rahula, not as a philosophical exercise, but as something to be returned to, tested, and gradually inhabited through the ordinary material of a daily life that will provide ample opportunity, whether or not it is sought. The same simile is extended in that teaching to water, to fire, to wind. Develop a mind like water. People wash clean things in water and unclean things in water, and the water is not disgusted. Develop a mind like fire. Fire burns pleasant and unpleasant things alike, and is not defiled. Develop a mind like wind. The wind blows across everything without discrimination and is not tainted. The repetition in the original teaching is deliberate. The Buddha is saying, through accumulation, that the quality he is pointing at is as fundamental and as available as the elements themselves. It is not exotic. It is not reserved for the particularly gifted or the particularly advanced. It is as ordinary as earth and water and fire and wind, and as available to anyone willing to develop it gradually, proportionally, a little more today than yesterday. The instruction is not to become the earth immediately. It is to develop a mind like the earth, the word develop carrying all of its implications of gradual cultivation, of something that grows through attention and time, rather than arriving whole through a single act of will. The same proportionality that lives in Ajahn Chah's sentence lives here too, a little more like the earth today than yesterday, a little more tomorrow than today. The ground of the mind becoming gradually more stable, gradually less overturned by what lands on it, gradually more able to receive the full range of what a life contains, without treating each arrival as something requiring the reorganization of everything. The grip loosened is not the relationship ended. It is the relationship freed from the weight of what was being asked of it, the impossible, exhausting demand that it provide the ground of your peace, rather than simply being what it is, a human connection, warm and valuable, and impermanent, and entirely insufficient as the foundation for a peace that needs to be buildable, regardless of what the connection does next. This is what Soma had in that forest. Not the absence of a voice, not the performance of someone above being troubled, but the presence of a ground stable enough that the voice, arriving with its full force, found nothing to overturn. The earth did not recoil from what was thrown on it. It received and remained. Allow that image to settle for a moment. The forest, the midday sun, the ground beneath the sitting figure, stable, undemanding, receiving everything and overturned by nothing. That quality of ground is not a metaphor for something else. It is a description of what the mind is like when the clinging has been set down and what remains beneath it has been allowed to become visible. And what remains beneath it, the nature of the mind when it is no longer being run by the grip and the vigilance and the contract and the craving, is the question the entire tradition has been circling since its beginning. Because the Buddha described it once, in 2 sentences, in a teaching so compressed and so precise that practitioners across every century have stopped at it and read it again. 2 sentences about the nature of the mind itself, what it actually is, underneath everything the noise has been covering. Not what most people expect, not what the craving mind, left to its own conclusions, would ever arrive at on its own. The ground beneath the ground is waiting. Here is the question worth sitting with before anything else. What if the thing you have been looking for in other people, the steadiness, the sense of being fully present somewhere that feels like home, the quality of okayness that arrives briefly when the right person is in the room, is not stored in those people at all? What if it is not stored anywhere outside you, not available through any arrangement of circumstances, however carefully constructed, not accessible through being chosen or seen or wanted or loved in the right way at the right time by the right person? What if it is already present, not as a potential to be developed or a reward to be earned, but as the actual nature of the mind itself, available right now, in this moment, in this room, obscured not by the absence of the right conditions, but by the very activity of looking for it somewhere else? This is not a comforting idea dressed in Buddhist clothing. It is a specific, precise, and genuinely surprising teaching, one that the Buddha stated with the compressed economy of someone who had examined the question from every available angle and arrived at an answer that required no elaboration, only careful attention. It appears in the Aimguttara Nikaya, the collection of numerical discourses, one of the 5 main collections of the Pali Canon, in a passage so brief that it occupies only a few lines and so precise that it has occupied practitioners for 25 centuries. The Buddha is addressing the monks directly. There is no narrative frame, no story surrounding it, no gradual approach. Just the statement, placed there with the confidence of someone reporting an observation rather than proposing a theory. The mind, monks, is luminous. It is defiled by adventitious defilements. The mind, monks, is luminous. It is freed from adventitious defilements. 4 sentences. The structure of them is as important as their content. The first sentence states the nature of the mind, luminous. The second sentence acknowledges what covers it, adventitious defilements. The third sentence restates the first. The mind is luminous, unchanged by what has been said in the second sentence, unaffected in its nature by what covers it. The fourth sentence states, what is therefore possible, freedom from the defilements, because they are not the mind itself and have no claim on the mind's fundamental nature. The word adventitious is doing the most important work in those 4 sentences. It is not a word that appears often in ordinary conversation, and its specific meaning is what makes the teaching precise rather than merely comforting. Adventitious means arriving from outside, not belonging to the inherent nature of the thing being described. An adventitious element is one that has come from elsewhere and attached itself, present, real in its effects, capable of obscuring what it covers, but not constitutive of the thing it is covering. Not the mind's nature, a visitor, a covering, something that arrived and can therefore, through practice, depart. The craving that makes solitude feel like punishment rather than space, adventitious. The need for validation that makes an unanswered message register as a small withdrawal of proof that you exist, adventitious. The voice that arrives in the forest and says, "You are not enough. Something is wrong with you." The silence around you is a verdict, adventitious. The exhaustion of the grip, the contract around love, the continuous low, grade vigilance of a mind that has decided peace is only available once certain conditions are met, all of it adventitious. All of it real in its effects, none of it the mind itself. This is where the teaching diverges sharply from anything the listener may have encountered in the broader wellness conversation. The idea that something good and complete is present inside you is not new. It circulates widely in self-help culture, in therapeutic frameworks, in the kind of spiritual encouragement that says, your worth is already there. You just need to remember it. The Buddhist teaching is not that teaching. It is something more specific and, in the long run, more useful. It is not saying that you have a permanent, complete, worthy self waiting beneath the noise to be uncovered and celebrated. Buddhism has been careful about this distinction for 25 centuries, because the idea of a permanent, unchanging inner self is precisely the kind of fixed identity that generates the craving and the clinging and the suffering that the teaching is addressing. A permanent self that is inherently worthy is still a self to be protected, to be confirmed, to be seen and validated. It has simply moved the craving from the outside to the inside and called the move liberation. That is not what the Buddha said. What the Buddha said is about awareness itself, the the quality of knowing, of being conscious, of the simple fact that experience is happening. Not a self that is aware. Awareness. The luminosity is the quality of the knowing, not the content of what is known. And that luminosity, that basic, undramatic, always present quality of conscious experience, is not produced by good circumstances or damaged by bad ones, not generated by being loved and destroyed by being ignored, not dependent on the arrival of the right person or the departure of the wrong conditions. It is simply what the mind is, underneath what the mind is currently full of. The practical implication is significant. If the peace being sought in other people's attention and approval were actually stored in those people, then the seeking would make sense. Go to where the thing is, obtain it, bring it back. But if what is being sought is the mind's own luminosity, temporarily obscured by the activity of seeking it elsewhere, then the seeking is not the solution. The seeking is part of the obscuration. Every reach outward for the confirmation that the mind is okay adds another layer of noise between the mind and the clarity it already has. The validation sought from another person does not illuminate the mind's luminosity. It covers it with the craving for more validation, which covers it further, which generates more seeking, in the cycle that every section of this journey has been describing from a different angle. Stopping the seeking is not the same as giving up. It is not resignation, not the performance of someone who has decided that wanting things is spiritually embarrassing and has learned to hide the wanting behind a posture of indifference. It is something more precise. The recognition that the direction of looking has been wrong, and that turning the attention around from the outward seeking to the quality of awareness that is doing the seeking changes everything about what is found. A 9th century Chan master named Dongshan Liangji understood this through something that happened to him while walking. Not in a monastery, not during formal practice, not in the company of a teacher who could point and say, "There, look there," walking alone on an ordinary path, the kind of walking that has no particular destination or spiritual intention attached to it. He crossed a stream and looked down at his own reflection in the water, and something in that moment, the image of himself, looking back at himself, the awareness aware of its own awareness, unlocked a recognition that he had been approaching from the outside and that the outside had consistently failed to provide. He wrote a verse about it that has been studied and returned to in Chan and Zen practice ever since. Today, walking alone, he wrote, "I meet him everywhere. He is now no other than myself, but I am now not him." The compression in those lines rewards patient attention. He meets him everywhere. The clarity, the luminosity, the quality of awareness that the Pabhasara Citta teaching describes, not in one special location or one elevated state, but everywhere, in every ordinary moment of walking and looking and being present on a path. He is now no other than myself, not separate from Dongshan, not waiting somewhere to be found, not stored in a teacher, or a teaching, or a community, but present as the very quality of his own awareness. But I am now not him, and here is where the Buddhist teaching parts from anything that could be misread as the discovery of a grand permanent self. Dongshan is not him, meaning what he has found is not a self to be identified with and carried proudly forward as an achievement. It is awareness, which is not a possession and not an identity, and not something that can be owned or lost or confirmed or denied by anyone's opinion of the person walking on the path. What Dongshan found walking alone by that stream is what the Pabhasara Chitta teaching is pointing at from the inside of a 4-sentence description. The same thing, approached from 2 directions, one through direct statement, one through the lived experience of a man on a path who stopped seeking it and found it had been present the entire time in the quality of the seeking itself. The peace that was being looked for in other people's attention is not stored in other people. It was never stored in other people. It was obscured by the looking, by the craving that said it was elsewhere, by the contract that said it was conditional, by the voice in the forest that said the person looking was not the right kind of person to find it. All of that is adventitious. All of that arrived and covered something that remained underneath the covering, exactly as it had always been. Luminous, present, undamaged by everything that had been thrown at it. The earth, receiving everything without being overturned by anything. The mind, luminous beneath everything that obscures it, without ceasing to be luminous. The 2 teachings from the last 2 sections are, at their depth, describing the same quality from different angles, the stable ground of equanimity in the first, the inherent clarity of awareness in the second, meeting in the same place, a mind that has stopped requiring anything outside itself in order to be what it already is. Dongshan walked alone and found this. The walking mattered. The aloneness mattered. Not because solitude is the only place this clarity is accessible, but because solitude removes the continuous outward, pointing of attention that makes the turning inward so difficult to sustain in the middle of ordinary social life. When there is no one to perform for, no validation to seek, no confirmation to either obtain or fail to obtain, the attention has nowhere to go but toward the quality of awareness itself, which is, it turns out, exactly where the clarity has been waiting all along. This is what makes solitude a teacher rather than a punishment. Not that it forces a reckoning, not that it strips away comfort and leaves the difficult things exposed, though it does both of those things too. It teaches because it removes the noise long enough for the mind to notice what the noise has been covering. And what the noise has been covering, the tradition insists with a consistency that spans every century and every school in which it has been transmitted, is luminous. Dongshan came to this on a path by a stream in 9th century China, walking alone, asking nothing of the moment and receiving, in that asking of nothing, what years of seeking had consistently failed to find. His verse arrived from that ordinariness, from that unhurried, unwitnessed movement through a landscape that required nothing of him and gave him, in requiring nothing, everything. But ordinariness is not the only doorway. Sometimes, the clarity does not arrive in quiet walking by a stream. Sometimes, it arrives in difficulty, in exhaustion, in physical pain, in the stripped and down extremity of a moment where everything unnecessary has been removed, not by choice, but by circumstance, and what remains is the mind meeting itself with nothing left to hide behind. In ancient India, a woman climbed a mountain alone on legs that were failing her, using a stick for support, with no teacher waiting at the summit, and no ceremony prepared for whatever she might find there. She did not arrive at the top in comfort or in ease. She arrived in pain, in exhaustion, in the particular stripped quality of someone who has given everything the climb required and has nothing left to perform or protect or manage. And in that state, in exactly that state, not despite it, the luminosity the Buddha described showed itself to her completely. The weight in the legs on a steep incline is a particular kind of discomfort, not the sharp, localized pain of an injury. Nothing is wrong. Nothing has torn or twisted or given way in a way that requires stopping. It is the honest, accumulating weight of asking a body to carry itself upward against gravity for longer than is comfortable, and the body responding with the only answer it has available, more effort required, reserves being drawn on, the ordinary ease of level ground, now a memory that the legs are quietly missing. A stick changes this in a specific way, not by removing the effort, but by redistributing it. Some of what the legs were doing alone, now shared between the legs and the arms, and the stick's contact with the ground, the weight of the body no longer carried by 2 points, but by 3. The relief is partial, and it does not last long before the arms begin to feel what the legs were feeling. But for a few steps, after finding the right angle and the right rhythm, there is a moment of something that is not quite ease, but is adjacent to it, the particular quality of effort that has found its own economy and is no longer fighting itself. And then the path turns upward again, and the economy dissolves, and the body returns to what it was doing before, carrying itself, step by step, toward a summit that is not yet visible. There was a woman in the early Buddhist community, one of the nuns who gathered around the Buddha's teaching in northern India in the 5th century, before the Common Era, who knew this weight with the precision of someone who had been carrying it for longer than a single afternoon's climb. Her name was Metikar, and she was ill. The texts do not specify the nature of her illness with clinical detail. The Pali Canon is not that kind of record. What they record is what her body could and could not do, and what it could not do was carry itself without pain, and what it could not stop doing was trying anyway. Her story is preserved in the Therigatha, the songs of the elder women, composed in the Pali language and transmitted across 25 centuries to arrive here intact. The Therigatha is among the oldest surviving literature in the world, composed and preserved by women. Not about women, not written by men imagining women's experience, but composed by the women themselves, the nuns of the early Sangha, recording in verse what their practice had produced and what it had cost, and what it had given them in return. These accounts were kept because the women who kept them understood that what Metika and others had found was not a private discovery. It was a transmission, something passed forward deliberately across centuries for people who had not yet arrived at the moment when they would need it. Real women, real mountains, real liberation, recorded by the people who experienced it, for the people who would come after them. Metika decided to climb a mountain. The texts do not record a reason for this decision in the way a modern document might. No explanatory context, no teacher's instruction, no community sending her with ceremony and good wishes toward the summit. She was a nun engaged in practice, and the practice took her up the mountain, and she went. Alone, because the practice was hers to do. Ill, because the illness was also hers, and there was no waiting for it to resolve before the life could continue. With a stick, because the mountain required it, and because using what is available without complaint or ceremony is, in its quiet way, already a form of practice. The climb would have taken time. A steep mountain path, walked slowly on painful legs, with a stick redistributing weight that the legs could not comfortably bear. This is not quick work. It is the kind of sustained, incremental effort that strips away everything that is not immediately necessary and leaves the mind with very little to attend to except what is directly present: the path, the breath, the leg lifting, the stick finding the ground, the weight transferring, the next step. This stripping is not comfortable. The mind that has been keeping itself occupied with the past and the future, with memories, anticipations, and the continuous management of everything that cannot be controlled, suddenly finds itself with nowhere to go except here. Here is the incline. Here is the pain in the legs. Here is the breath, shorter than it would be on flat ground, arriving and departing with the specific urgency of a body working hard. Here is the stick. Here is the ground. Here is the next step. Everything else the mind might prefer to be attending to is, for the duration of this effort, simply not available as a destination. What begins to happen in that enforced presence is what the Buddhist teaching calls the direct experience of impermanence, not as a concept understood and filed away, but as something happening in the body in real time, undeniable and immediate. The pain in the legs is not constant. It rises and eases in response to the particular angle of the path and the distribution of weight and the management of the stick. One step harder than the last, the next easier, the next harder, again in a different way. The breath is not constant. It deepens and shortens, arrives and departs, each breath complete in itself and gone before the next one begins. The effort is not constant. There are moments of something like rhythm, where the body finds its own arrangement with the mountain, and moments where that arrangement dissolves and has to be found again from nothing, from whatever the legs have left after everything they have already given. Everything arising, everything passing, nothing holding its exact shape from one moment to the next. And within that constant arising and passing, within the pain that is not always the same pain, the breath that is not always the same breath, the effort that is not always the same effort, something that is not arising and passing at all, something present for the rhythm and for the dissolution of the rhythm, for the easier steps and for the harder ones, for the moment when the path turns upward without warning and the legs protest and the breath shortens and the stick has to find new ground. Present for all of it, without preference between the easier and the harder, without the need for the mountain to be more accommodating than it is. This is the luminous mind the Buddha described, not waiting at the summit, not reserved for moments of ease, but present within the difficulty, because it is present within everything, adventitious defilements, and all, undimmed by what covers it, and available to anyone whose attention has been stripped by pain, by effort, by the enforced immediacy of a body working at its limit, of the noise that usually prevents it from being noticed. Metika was not climbing toward clarity. She was climbing inside it, one painful step at a time, the clarity becoming more available with each step, not because the pain was easing, but because the mind had nothing left to spend on anything except what was directly present. The equanimity the earth simile pointed toward was not something she would collect at the summit, like a reward for effort completed. She was inhabiting it on the path, step by step, in the specific way that genuine practice is always inhabited, not as an achievement, but as a quality of attention, present within the difficulty, rather than available only after it. Every small releasing of the grip, of the requirement that the legs hurt less, that the path be shorter, that the illness not have come, that the conditions be other than they were, every small releasing produced its proportional peace on an ancient mountain, in a body that was giving everything it had, and finding, in the giving, that what remained was more than sufficient. When she reached the summit, she sat down. The Therigatha records this with the economy of a text that trusts the people who receive it to understand what sitting down means after a climb like that. the specific quality of a body that has given everything the effort required and is now, for the first time since the path began, still. Legs that had been working for hours, suddenly at rest. Breath that had been short and urgent, beginning to lengthen. The mountain beneath her, receiving her weight the way the earth receives everything, without comment, without requirement, simply there. The summit air, thinner and cooler than the air on the path below, moving across a body that had earned its stillness through every difficult step that preceded it. The sky above, vast and indifferent, in the most freeing sense of the word, making no demands, offering no verdict, simply present as the space within which everything else was occurring. And in that stillness, in that exhaustion, in that complete and unwitnessed aloneness at the top of a mountain in ancient India, liberation arrived. The Therigatha records it without ceremony. No lightning, no vision, no sudden flooding of light through the body. Just the arrival of what had been approaching through every step of the climb, the mind, having stopped adding its own resistance to what was already present, finding itself in the clarity that the resistance had been covering all along. The suffering and the clarity were not separate events, separated by the reaching of a summit. They were the same event, moved through without flinching, carried without the additional weight of requiring the difficulty to be otherwise than it was. The difficulty was not the obstacle cleared before the condition arrived. The difficulty was the condition. The women who preserved this account across 25 centuries knew what they were keeping. Not a story about exceptional capacity or unusual spiritual gifts. Not an account of someone so advanced that her experience has no relationship to an ordinary life. A record, precise, undramatic, preserved with the care of something that needed to reach the people who would need it. Of what becomes available when the mind stops requiring conditions to improve before clarity is permitted to arrive. The account survived because what it contains is not historical curiosity. It is instruction, as usable today as it was in the hands of the women who first wrote it down, for anyone on a difficult path who has not yet understood that the difficulty and the doorway are the same thing. Metikar did not announce what happened at the top of the mountain. There was no one there to announce it to, and that absence of audience was itself a teaching her verses carry quietly forward. What arrived at that summit was not diminished by having no witness. It did not require confirmation to be real. It did not need to be spoken, explained, or received by anyone in order to be fully what it was. The deepest things this tradition suggests across every school and century tend to be like this, most fully themselves in the absence of performance, most completely present when there is no one watching and therefore no reason to be anything other than exactly what is. There is a moment in Buddhist literature where an entire room of accomplished teachers tried to put the deepest teaching into words, each offering their most precise and careful answer, and the last person asked said nothing at all. Not from hesitation, not from ignorance, not from the performance of someone dramatically withholding, from the recognition that what was being asked about had no adequate container in language, and that the most honest response was the one that did not pretend otherwise. The room fell silent, and the silence was recognized by everyone present as the most complete answer that had been given. Think about the last time you were in a room where everyone was performing. Not a stage performance, the ordinary kind. A dinner table where the conversation moved fast, and the unspoken rule was that everyone should have something interesting to contribute. A work meeting where holding a position, any position, felt safer than the admission that you were still thinking. A social gathering where the measure of a good evening was whether you had been witty enough, engaged enough, sufficiently present in the ways the gathering required presence to look. There is a specific exhaustion that comes from this kind of room. Not the tiredness of genuine effort, the tiredness of sustained management, the continuous monitoring of what is being said and what has not yet been said and what should be said next, and whether what was just said landed in the way it was intended, and what the expression on the face across the table means about how it was received. The energy required to maintain a version of yourself that the room will find acceptable, articulate, interesting, sufficiently assured, while simultaneously tracking whether the performance is succeeding. Most people leave these rooms more drained than they arrived, not because the company was bad or the evening was unpleasant, because maintaining the performance costs something that rest does not fully restore. Now, a different room. Ancient India, somewhere between the 1st and 2nd century of the Common Era in the Mahayana Buddhist tradition. A gathering of bodhisattvas, beings of advanced practice and considerable accumulated wisdom, convened around a single question. The question was precise. How does one enter the Dharma gate of non-duality? How does one arrive at reality as it actually is, beyond the divisions and distinctions that the ordinary mind uses to navigate experience? One by one, they answered, and the answers were excellent. Each bodhisattva offered a formulation drawn from deep understanding, paired opposites resolved into unity, conceptual distinctions dissolved into clear seeing, the various dualisms of ordinary experience shown to be the mind's superimpositions rather than reality's actual structure. The room was full of genuine wisdom, carefully expressed, each answer more refined than ordinary thought and more precise than casual spiritual encouragement. Anyone listening would have recognized that what was being offered was not performance. It was real. And still, something was missing from every answer in the room. Then Manjushri spoke. Manjushri is the bodhisattva of wisdom in the Mahayana tradition, the figure who embodies the sharpest, most penetrating understanding available. What he said was this: all of the preceding answers, however excellent, had used words. And words are themselves a form of duality, the distinction between speaker and spoken, between the word and what the word refers to, between the understanding that produces the statement and the statement that is understood. Language, by its nature, operates through distinction. The gate of non-duality cannot be adequately contained in the language of gates. Then Manjushri asked Vimalakirti. Vimalakirti was a layman, not a monk, not a bodhisattva of cosmic stature, but a householder in the city of Vaishali, who had, through practice and understanding, arrived at a clarity that the sutra places beyond what most monastics in the text had achieved. He was known for this clarity. The bodhisattvas and monks in the gathering would have expected something from him, a formulation more complete than the others, an answer that resolved what Manjushri's observation had opened. Vimalakirti said nothing. Complete silence. Not the silence of someone gathering words or organizing thoughts or hesitating before an answer. Silence as the answer itself, the silence that does not prepare for speech, but simply is, without apology and without the performance of profundity, without any of the signals that usually indicate something meaningful, is being withheld for dramatic effect. Manjushri's response has been remembered for nearly 2,000 years. Excellent, he said. Not a letter, not a syllable, that is truly entering the Dhamma, gate of non-duality. The room recognized it. That is the detail worth sitting with, not just Manjushri's assessment, but the recognition of the whole gathering, that the silence was more complete than any of the preceding answers. The brilliant teachers, who had each offered something genuinely good, understood that what Vimalakirti had offered was of a different order entirely. Not better eloquence, the absence of the need for eloquence, the specific freedom of a mind that had nothing to prove, and therefore nothing that required expression. What makes this scene so precise as a teaching is what it reveals about the relationship between the need to explain yourself and the state of your own inner peace. When Tallaputta was still performing for crowds, still managing the emotions of audiences with the tools of his professional life, the performance was not vanity, it was avoidance, maintained at considerable cost. The need to keep the crowd engaged was inseparable from the need to keep the inward questions from becoming audible. The same dynamic operates in the ordinary social room, not on a stage, not with a crowd, but in the continuous low-grade performance of someone who needs to be understood correctly in order to feel secure about who they are. The need to explain yourself, to justify your positions, to account for your choices, to ensure that the people around you have an accurate and favorable understanding of who you are and why you do what you do is rarely about them. It is almost always about the discomfort of allowing yourself to be misunderstood, and the discomfort of allowing yourself to be misunderstood is almost always about what the misunderstanding seems to confirm about something you are not yet entirely settled about within yourself. The explanation is not for the listener. It is for the part of you that is still seeking the confirmation the listener might provide. Vimalakirti's silence came from a different place entirely. It was not the silence of someone managing an impression or withholding information or declining to engage. It was the silence of someone who had nothing to protect, no position to defend, no identity to maintain, no version of themselves that required the room's agreement in order to remain stable. When there is nothing to protect, silence is not a strategy. It is simply what is true. The 8th century Indian master Shantideva understood this relationship between inner peace and the craving for social confirmation with a directness that is unusual even within a tradition known for its precision about the mind. In his Bodhicharyavatara, the guide to the Bodhisattva's way of life, one of the most studied texts in the Mahayana tradition, he examined this craving with the candor of someone who had looked at it honestly in himself and found it less comfortable than any performance of indifference to praise would suggest. Flattery, he wrote, accomplishes nothing useful. Being praised does not make you wealthier or healthier or more free. The praise arrives, produces a brief warmth, and departs, leaving the craving for more praise exactly where it was before the praise arrived, which is how craving always works, in every form, at every scale. The mind that needs praise to feel sufficient will need more praise tomorrow, because the praise is treating a symptom and not the condition, and the condition, the belief that sufficiency is located in other people's assessment, remains entirely intact beneath the temporary relief of having been told something good about yourself. What Shantideva asked himself in those verses was when he would finally wander in forests alone, without companion, knowing his work is done. Not as a complaint about people or a romantic attachment to wilderness, as the specific longing of someone who has understood what the continuous performance costs and is ready, genuinely ready, to put it down. The forest he was longing for was not a place. It was the state of mind that Vimalakirti demonstrated in that room, the state of having nothing to explain, nothing to defend, nothing that required the understanding or agreement or approval of anyone present in order to remain what it was. This is where the section's teaching becomes practical rather than philosophical. Not all self-explanation is compulsive, and not all communication is performance. The distinction that matters is simpler than it might appear. When you explain yourself from a place of genuine peace, the explanation is for the other person's benefit, offered without anxiety about its reception, complete in itself, whether or not it produces the desired response. When you explain yourself from the craving for confirmation, the explanation is for your own benefit, generated by the discomfort of being potentially misunderstood, and its success or failure is measured entirely by whether the other person's response has temporarily quieted the craving that produced it. The first is communication. The second is seeking. And seeking, as every section of this journey has been demonstrating from a different angle, is the activity that covers what it is trying to find. Stopping the performance is not rudeness. It is not coldness, not withdrawal, not the cultivation of an indifference dressed in spiritual language to make it acceptable. It is the specific relief of no longer burning energy on a project that was never going to succeed, because the confirmation being sought was never stored in the place it was being sought, and the clarity available in the silence was present all along beneath the noise of the seeking. Vimalakirti sat in a room full of people expecting brilliance and offered nothing. Not as a demonstration, not as a teaching device calculated to produce a particular effect, as the natural expression of a mind that had no requirement to be anything other than what it was in that moment, present, settled, and complete, without a single word to show for it. What Manjushri and the gathering recognized was not an unusual feat, the performance of a silence so impressive it surpassed eloquence. They recognized the absence of the need that generates both eloquence and its performance. The freedom of a mind that has genuinely stopped requiring the room to confirm what it already knows. This quality is available in proportion to the releasing that the previous sections have been describing, a little more accessible with each small loosening of the grip, each small releasing of the contract that says peace is conditional on being understood, confirmed, and chosen. A little less explaining produces a little more ease in the same direct and proportional relationship that runs through every teaching in this tradition. The releasing and the peace are not separated by a long journey. They are the same movement, felt immediately at whatever scale it is practiced. What Vimalakirti demonstrated, and what Shantideva longed for, and what Metika inhabited at the top of a mountain in pain, and what Soma had when the voice found nothing to attach to, these are not different achievements, requiring different practices leading to different destinations. They are the same quality of mind, arrived at through different paths, described in different centuries and different traditions, with different vocabulary, all pointing at the same thing, a mind that has stopped requiring anything outside itself in order to be exactly what it already is. Vimalakirti's silence was the silence of someone who had already arrived somewhere real. What he demonstrated in that room was not a technique but a direction, the specific orientation of a mind that has chosen inner settledness over the continuous labor of social maintenance, chosen the forest over the crowd, chosen the quality of its own awareness over the quality of other people's opinions about that awareness. Choosing that direction consciously, deliberately, with clear eyes, understanding what is being chosen and what is being set down, looks different from the accumulated wisdom of someone who has practiced their way to Vimalakirti's settled silence. It looks like a choice made before dawn, in cold water, in a forest, by someone young enough that the choice is not yet inevitable, and old enough to understand exactly what it means. It looks like the specific urgency of a person who has seen impermanence clearly enough that waiting no longer seems like a reasonable option. That choice, and the forest river where it was made, is where this journey goes next. Cold water has a particular quality before dawn. Not the cold of ice or the cold of shock, the cold of a forest river in the hours before the sun has reached it. When the water holds the temperature of the night, it has been moving through, and the air above it is only marginally warmer, and the difference between the two is small enough that stepping from one into the other produces less a gasp than a slow, complete waking of every surface of the skin simultaneously. The body becomes entirely present in a way that warmth and comfort rarely produce. Not painfully, precisely. Every boundary of the physical self made suddenly, clearly known. The forest around a river before dawn has its own quality of sound. Not silence. The forest is never entirely silent, but a particular arrangement of sounds that belongs specifically to the hours before light, the water moving over and around whatever the riverbed contains, the occasional shift of something in the trees, whose name and location remain unknown, the specific quality of darkness that has sound in it, the way daylight has color, present and textured and entirely undemanding of any response. Standing alone in water like this, in darkness like this, is not lonely. That is the first thing worth noticing. Not because the aloneness is being managed or suppressed or reframed into something more acceptable, but because the body is too thoroughly present for the mind to be elsewhere, too completely occupied with the immediate reality of cold water and dark air, and the sounds of a forest going about its own unwitnessed business, to be simultaneously occupied with the absence of anyone to share it with. This is the reversal the journey has been moving towards since it began. At the opening, aloneness was something experienced as being done to the listener. A Friday evening, a dark phone, the hollow feeling of a full table that was somehow not enough. Here, in a forest river before dawn, aloneness is something chosen, inhabited, and found to be precisely adequate to the moment it contains. There was a young monk in the early Buddhist community who knew this river, or one like it. His name was Samidi, and the Sayutta Nikaya, one of the 5 main collections of the Pali Canon, records an encounter he had while bathing alone in a forest before dawn that has the quality of something preserved because it is useful rather than because it is dramatic. The encounter is brief. the teaching inside it is not. Samidi had come to the forest river to bathe, as he did, alone, in the dark, before the day required him to be anywhere or do anything or present himself to anyone. The text does not explain why he chose this. It does not need to, because the choice itself is the teaching, present before a word of dialogue has been exchanged. He was young. He was healthy. He had gone forth into the monastic life, not because his circumstances had collapsed and left no alternative, but because something in him had understood, with a clarity that did not require argument, that the life available to him outside the forest was not the life that most needed to be lived. He was standing in the cold water when a deity appeared. In the Pali Canon, deities are not exotic interruptions. They are beings from higher realms who appear occasionally in the teaching record, usually to ask questions rather than to provide answers. This one was curious in the way that someone is curious when they have encountered something they do not quite have a framework for. Here was a young man in a cold river, before dawn, in a forest, alone, when pleasure and company and the ordinary consolations of a human life were available to him, when youth itself is, by conventional reckoning, the season most suited to enjoying what the world offers before age arrives to narrow the options. Why? The deity asked it simply. Why this? Why now? Why the forest instead of the life that was available? Samidi's answer arrived without hesitation and without the elaborate philosophical architecture that might have been expected from a young monastic trying to justify his choice to a being from a higher realm. It was urgent in the specific way that things are urgent when they are simply true and require no decoration. He had gone forth while still young, he said, because old age would come. He did not know when death would arrive. He wanted to practice now, while he could, before it was too late. The Pali tradition has a word for the understanding that produces this kind of answer. It is samvega, sometimes translated as spiritual urgency, sometimes as the sense of existential shock that arrives when impermanence is seen clearly rather than merely known as a concept. Samvega is not anxiety about death, though it begins with the recognition of death's inevitability. It is the specific quality of clarity that arrives when impermanence stops being an idea that is acknowledged and agreed with, and starts being something felt in the body, understood in the bones, producing not paralysis, but the opposite, a clear-eyed recognition that the time to practice is not later, not when circumstances improve, not when the conditions are more comfortable or the choices more obvious or the path less uncertain. The time is now, in this life, in this body, with whatever is available today and whatever is not. This is what Samidi had in the cold water before dawn. Not depression, not rejection, not the resignation of someone whose life had offered nothing worth choosing, and who had therefore retreated to the forest as a consolation. The opposite, a person young enough that the world's offerings were fully available, clear, eyed enough to have looked at those offerings honestly, and moved enough by what he had understood about impermanence to choose, before the choosing became harder, a direction that pointed towards something the offerings could not provide. The deity was not finished. Having received the answer, it offered something in return, a series of suggestions, gentle and plausible, about the pleasures available to a young person in the world, about the possibility of enjoying what life offers now and practicing later, about the sensible sequencing of a life that takes its pleasures first and attends to the deeper questions at a more appropriate time. The suggestions had the quality of reasonable advice, not malicious, not obviously wrong, simply the counsel of someone operating from a different understanding of what time is for and how much of it is likely to be available. Samadhi did not engage with any of it. Not dismissively, not with the performance of someone who wants it known that they are above being tempted, simply without the traction that engagement requires. The deity's suggestions found, in him, the same absence of purchase that Mara's taunt found in Soma, that the crowd's wanting found in the Buddha walking toward the forest at Ikchanangala. Not resistance, the absence of what resistance requires on the other side of it. This is the third form of craving the Buddhist teaching identifies, and the subtlest. The first is craving for pleasure, the familiar reaching toward what feels good, what satisfies, what provides the warmth of sensory experience or emotional confirmation. The second is craving for existence, the need to be seen, confirmed, chosen, to have one's presence registered and validated by the world outside. The third is craving for non-existence, the wish to escape, to not be, to remove oneself from the discomfort of a life that keeps producing more difficulty than the mind knows how to meet. All three operate through the same mechanism, the placement of a condition on peace, the insistence that peace is available only once something is obtained or something is avoided. What samvega dissolves is not these cravings through effort, but through clarity. When impermanence is seen clearly enough, when the fact of aging, illness, and death stops being a philosophical position and starts being something understood with the body's own knowing, the cravings lose their urgency, not because they have been suppressed, but because what they were promising has been examined honestly enough to see that the promise was never sustainable. Pleasure arrives and passes. Existence is confirmed and then requires continuous reconfirmation, which is exhausting and never finally complete. Non-existence would remove the suffering and also the practice and also the clarity that is the only thing in this tradition that actually addresses the suffering at its source. Samvega does not condemn the cravings. It simply offers a clearer view of where they lead, and from that clearer view, a different direction becomes available. Samadhi had that clearer view in the cold river before dawn. It is why the deity's offerings found no traction. not because he was unusually disciplined, or unusually indifferent to pleasure, or unusually advanced in practice, but because he had already seen what the offerings were offering and understood, with the specific lucidity of someone who has genuinely looked, that they were not the thing he was standing in the cold water for. The distinction between solitude as something that happens to a person and solitude as a direction a person chooses is the entire distance between the opening of this journey and where it has arrived. The Friday evening with the dark phone was solitude as something happening, imposed by circumstances, felt as deprivation, the absence of what was wanted, experienced as a verdict about the value of the person enduring it. Samadhi, in the river, was solitude as a direction, chosen with clear eyes, inhabited with full presence, found to be not the absence of something good, but the presence of something that the noise and company and continuous performance of ordinary social life consistently cover. The cold water was not a consolation for the warmth that was missing. It was the point. The darkness was not the absence of light that would eventually arrive to make the scene acceptable. It was the condition in which something specific and irreplaceable was available. The river's own sounds, the skin's precise waking, the mind's complete presence in the only moment that actually existed. Samadhi had not arrived at the river resigned to what he could not have. He had arrived at the river understanding what he was choosing, and choosing it fully, in the cold and the dark and the aloneness, before the sun rose over the forest, and the day's ordinary demands resumed their claims on his attention. He had made his choice before the world had taken anything from him, before age, disappointment, loss, or the gradual attrition of circumstances had narrowed the options and made the forest feel less like a direction and more like the only place left to go. That is what makes his story a teaching rather than merely an account. The choice was free, made in full possession of everything the world was offering, and it pointed away from those offerings not from bitterness, but from genuine understanding of what they were and were not. There is another story in this tradition about a man who made a version of the same choice, but under circumstances so stripped, so emptied of what the world usually provides as evidence that a life is going well, that a scholar arrived specifically to survey the wreckage and deliver a verdict. The man had no possessions, no community, no reputation worth mentioning, no comfort that would have registered as comfort by any ordinary measure. He had, by every external account, nothing. His response to the scholar's verdict was a song. The stone of a Himalayan cave is cold in a way that has nothing to do with the season. Even in summer, even when the sun has been on the rock face for hours and the air outside carries genuine warmth, the interior of a deep cave holds its own temperature, the temperature of the mountain itself, which is the temperature of something that has been stone for longer than any human accounting of time, and will be stone for longer still. It is not hostile cold. It is indifferent cold, the cold of something that has no position on whether you are comfortable, no investment in your preference between warmth and its absence, no capacity to be moved by your opinion of the conditions it provides. It simply is what it is, at the temperature it is, and the person inside it is either at peace with that or not. The light inside such a cave at dawn arrives slowly and at an angle, entering through whatever opening faces the direction of the rising sun and moving across the stone floor with the unhurried specificity of light that has had a long way to travel and has arrived without urgency. A fire, very small, built from whatever the mountain's edges have offered in the way of fuel, sustained at the minimum required rather than at the maximum available, produces a warmth that is local and partial, warming what is nearest to it and leaving the rest of the cave to its own temperature. The smell is altitude and stone, and the specific clean quality of air that has not been breathed by many people, that has come directly from the height above and carries nothing with it except the cold and the thin oxygen and the faint smell of whatever grows at the edge of where things grow. The sound is wind, distant, and the fire, small, and the breathing of one person, steady. A man lives here. He has lived here long enough that the cave has the quality of a inhabited rather than occupied space, not arranged for comfort, because comfort in the ordinary sense has not been the organizing principle, but arranged for practice, for the specific requirements of a life whose entire attention has been redirected from the management of circumstances to the investigation of the mind that experiences circumstances. There is no furniture worth the name. There are no books, not because books are unwelcome, but because the practice he is engaged in does not require them, and the mountain does not easily provide them, and the weight of carrying them here was a weight he set down long ago, along with the other weights he set down when he came. There is a robe, worn and repaired, and worn again. There is the fire. There is the cave. There is the practice. His name is Milarepa, and in the 11th and 12th centuries of the Common Era, in the mountains of Tibet, he became one of the most celebrated practitioners in the Vajrayana Buddhist tradition, not through institutional achievement or scholarly accumulation, or the kind of social standing that announces itself through visible markers, but through the specific, unverifiable, entirely internal achievement of a mind that had released its grip on everything the world uses to measure a life, and found, in that releasing, a freedom that the world's measurements had no category for. The scholar arrived on a day that the texts do not specify, which is appropriate. The day does not matter, because the encounter could have happened on any day, at any point in the years Milarepa spent in that cave, and its essential content would have been identical. He was a man of learning, of standing, of the kind of accumulated credential that announces itself through formal robes, and the bearing of someone accustomed to being received with the deference appropriate to his position. He had made the journey up to the cave, which was not a comfortable journey, which required effort and some discomfort, and the willingness to arrive somewhere remote and cold and entirely lacking in the amenities that make arrivals pleasant. And having made it, he looked at what he had arrived at with the eyes of someone conducting an assessment. What the assessment found was not impressive. The cave was cold, and the fire was small, and the man inside it was thin, in a way that suggested the food situation was unreliable, and the robe was worn, and there were no books, and no community, and no markers of scholarly achievement, and no indication that this was a place where anything of substance had accumulated. The scholar's survey of the scene had the quality of someone who had expected more and was now reconciling the expectation with a reality that fell well short of it, not dramatically, not with hostility, but with the quiet, deflating recognition that whatever he had heard about this man, the evidence in front of him, did not obviously support it. He said what the survey had produced in him, not cruelly, factually, in the way that a person states what they observe when they have been trained to trust observation and to speak from it directly. No status, no learning, no community, no comfort, no possessions, worth cataloguing. A cave, a small fire, a worn robe, and a man whose physical condition suggested that the cave was not providing adequately for the ordinary requirements of a human body. What kind of life was this? What had been accomplished here? What was there to show for the years spent in this cold and remote and entirely unwitnessed way? Milarepa sang. Not in the way that people sing when they are deflecting or performing or trying to change the subject through charm. In the way that something sings when the container that would have turned it into speech has been set down so long ago that it no longer exists, when what is true simply comes out in whatever form it takes, which in Milarepa's case was song, had always been song, the songs of the 100,000 songs of Milarepa that the Tibetan tradition preserved because they were not composed but simply true, expressed in a form adequate to their own content. He sang about the cave, not defensively, not with the strained enthusiasm of someone trying to reframe deprivation as abundance, with the straightforward accuracy of someone describing what is actually present rather than what is absent. The cave was his palace, not because it had the qualities of a palace, not because it provided what palaces provide, but because a palace is a place where a person is fully at home, and he was fully at home in this cave, in the way that only a mind that has stopped requiring its surroundings to be other than they are can be fully at home anywhere. His solitude was his wealth. Again, not as a reframing of poverty into something more bearable, as an accurate description of what solitude had produced in him over the years of practice in that cave. The scholar had arrived carrying his learning, his standing, his community, his accumulated credential, all of it real, all of it valuable in the world that had produced it, none of it available to him in the cave, because none of it transferred to the currency the cave dealt in. What the cave dealt in was the specific wealth of a mind that had released the grip on everything the world uses to generate the craving that generates, the suffering that generates, the seeking that generates more craving in the cycle that every section of this journey has been examining from a different angle. Milarepa had released the grip. Not once, not dramatically, not through a single act of heroic renunciation, through years of the gradual releasing that Ajahn Chah's sentence describes, a little more each day, proportional peace arriving with each proportional loosening, until the grip was gone entirely, and with it, the fear that had made the grip feel necessary. What the scholar was looking at, without yet having a framework for what he was seeing, was the complete expression of everything this journey has been moving toward. The Buddha walking away from the crowd at Ichanangala had released the grip on fame. Here was a man for whom fame had simply never taken hold, who had walked past the opportunity for it without looking back. The proud monk in the Ekavihari teaching had confused physical solitude with genuine inner quiet. Here was a man in whom the outer and inner solitude had become identical, a cave and a mind equally still, equally uncluttered, equally at ease with their own contents. Talaputta had spent years in conversation with his own mind, learning to treat it as a companion rather than an obstacle. Here was a man whose mind had become, through that same quality of patient interior attention, the only company he required, and the richest company available to him. Soma had refused to be diminished by the voice that said she was not enough. Milarepa had arrived at the state where the voice had nothing to say, because there was no identity left to attack, no position to undermine, no self-image that required the scholar's good opinion in order to remain intact. The earth simile had pointed toward a mind that receives everything without being overturned. The scholar's survey of everything Milarepa lacked landed on him with the same effect that anything thrown on the earth produces, received without drama, without recoil, without the reorganization of the self around the impact. Metikar had found liberation in difficulty, in pain, in the stripped down conditions of a body working at its limit with no audience. Milarepa had been living in those conditions for years, not as a preparation for liberation, but as the ongoing expression of it. Vimalakirti's silence had demonstrated the freedom of having nothing to prove. Milarepa sang, which is a different form of the same freedom, the expression not of someone trying to convince anyone of anything, but of someone whose inner state is simply accurate, and whose only relationship to the scholar's assessment is the recognition that the assessment has no purchase on what it is assessing. Samidhi had chosen before the world had taken anything from him. Milarepa had chosen after the world had been given every opportunity to provide what it provides, had looked at those provisions with clear eyes, and had walked in a different direction for reasons that the years in the cave had not given him any cause to revise. The scholar's tears, when they came, and the texts record that they came, that something in the song reached past the assessment and the credential and the survey of deficiencies and found the place in him that knew, beneath the knowing, what he was in the presence of were not the tears of someone persuaded. Persuasion operates through argument, through the marshalling of evidence, through the demonstration that one position is better supported than another. What moved the scholar was not an argument. It was recognition, the specific, undefended recognition of someone encountering something real and finding that reality does something to a person that no amount of prepared response can entirely manage. What was real in that cave was the complete absence of the suffering that the scholar, for all his learning and standing and community, had not found a way to be free of. The craving for validation, present in him, present in everyone who has not yet found their way to the releasing the tradition describes, was simply not present in Milarepa. Not suppressed, not managed, not spiritually disguised as something more acceptable, absent, released along with the grip on everything else that had been released in the years of practice in the cold cave, with the small fire and the worn robe and the thin body and the song that came out when the truth needed expression and had nothing in the way of it. This is the quiet empowerment the journey has been moving toward, not the empowerment of achievement or accumulation, not the confidence of someone who has obtained enough of what the world offers to feel secure in their position. The specific, unshakable quiet of someone who has set something heavy down and discovered that the setting down was not loss, but relief, that what was being carried was the source of the weight, and the setting down was not deprivation, but the end of a burden that had never been necessary. Milarepa had nothing. He needed nothing. And in needing nothing, he had lost nothing, because what cannot be taken from a person is not what they own, but what they have released the need to own, not what they protect, but what they have released the need to protect, not what they have accumulated, but what remains when accumulation has been understood clearly enough to be set down. The scholar came to survey what was missing. He left having encountered something he did not have a word for, something the song had carried from the cave into his chest, in the way that things true enough carry themselves, without requiring the listener's agreement, without needing the listener's validation, complete and present and entirely independent of what anyone thought about it. That is the final teaching of this journey, arrived at through the cave in the Himalayas, the way every teaching in this tradition arrives, not as a conclusion to be accepted, but as a recognition to be inhabited, available to anyone willing to begin the releasing, a little at a time, proportionally, in the life they are already living, in the solitude they are already inside.